back and not touch anything. All righty. All right, well, we'll kick it off. Thank you very much for speaking with me today. Today I'm joined by Tye Copeland. Tye began his military career as an enlisted intelligence analyst in the 82nd Airborne Division, deploying to Operation Iraqi Freedom for 15 months with 573 Cavalry in 2006 and again in 2008. Since then, Tye's career has grown, taking him to Afghanistan, multiple special forces groups as an intelligence officer. Tye currently serves as a Chief Warrant Officer 3 with U.S. Army Intelligence Center of Excellence. Welcome, Tye.
Hey, how's it going? Good to see you, Sean.
Good. Yeah, I haven't seen you in years, but it's great to talk to you. Let's start off with your experiences because you were telling me that you came into 573 as an E2, you said?
Yeah, so straight out of basic training to airborne school, I joined what was then actually 3505, right? You guys had just gotten
Hmm.
back from Hurricane Katrina, and I had just arrived at the unit right before the transition from 3505 or 3505, or what used to be called 3P to 573 CAV. And then we made that transition, and then shortly after that, we were out the door heading into Iraq.
Yeah, that was a really intense train up schedule with, I think we had a year or less. Actually, after that, yeah, September, and we deployed again by August of 2006. So it wasn't much time to come together as an organization. But speaking of that, coming into a unit that was in transition and being at the very ground level of that organization, and especially as an organizational identity was just beginning to form, it's been exciting, kind of a fresh slate being drafted before your very eyes. Do you have any experiences about seeing the unit being put together, kind of how it was managed, organized, and planned?
Yeah, I was very young in the Army at the time. I just saw a lot of great leaders. At the time, I didn't know how great they were because I was so fresh in my military
Hmm.
career, and it was very new to me at that time. But I remember immediately going to, OP 13 to do training, and then we went straight out the door to GRTC. And then, shortly thereafter that, we were downrange, which was supposed to be a 12-month deployment that turned into a 15-month deployment. And
Hmm.
then I came back for 10 months and then left again for another 12 with what was then Sergeant Major Kroll. I can't remember the commander's name at the time, but, after Colonel Pappas left, I was very naive at the time. So when I joined the military, we were downrange and they were offering, who wants to reenlist? And little did I know that commanders rotated out. And Colonel Pappas was there at the time. And I was like, wow, I could follow these leaders in this unit anywhere, any day. And I didn't know that, once you get back, there's a mass exodus of leadership, usually across the organization, because they're in their time to move on to go somewhere else and get some more experience as a leader or go lead another organization. So I re-enlisted to stay in 573 CAV, which was good because I got to go on another deployment with them. And although some of the best leaders in 573 CAV left, we still had some that stayed around for a little while. So that was good. But yeah, what a transition, what an experience as a new soldier. I went from E1 all the way to E6 in the unit. So
Mm.
I went from being the very most junior person in the office to being the NCOIC of the S2 by the time I left. So quite the experience, but thankfully I had great leaders around me that taught me what I needed to know to be a leader. When you join the military, you don't know how to develop leadership skills, right? You either got to
Mm.
see it, read about it, or observe it and be involved in it in some way to develop the leadership skills. And then you have to implement, right? You have to say, okay, based off of all the leaders that I've been with, now that I'm a leader, how do I create the team that what was so unique about 573 was the team that was created and how they really cared about everyone. And then once you become a leader, growing up in an organization like that, you say to yourself, okay, how do I build a team that's just as good with the same camaraderie that we had experienced there in 573? Because, since I've been in that or left that unit, I've never experienced anything quite like the camaraderie that we had during that first deployment or my time in 573 Cav.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I was speaking with another gentleman about that recently, and I know from my own memories, just when we did get into combat, at Turkey 1, seeing how our headquarters unit was out in the middle of everything with us, doing planning, con doing combat maneuvers with their ground elements, coordinating all the CAS for
Yeah.
F-16s and Apaches, medevacs, all of it. And they were just in the middle. They weren't in an office somewhere. It was on the ground with you. And it just gave so much trust that your leaders cared because they could see you. And I mean, not to get into darker situations, but even during some of the casualties we took, I do remember seeing even Colonel Pappas himself out there helping oversee medevacs. And that institutionally just taught me what leadership was about.
Yeah, I think at the time it was great to see leaders that really cared for the soldiers because
Mhm.
not not all the time do you see it directly. Like you observe like an activity or an event that takes place to where you're like, oh wow, these leaders really care about not just the organization and themselves, but they really care about every single one in this unit. And I actually remember on that first deployment, we were out during, I want to say it was Turkey Bowl 2, and General Pappas had pizza delivered to everyone that was
Hmm.
out there via, Black Hawk drop off. So that was there's nothing that you really ever experience like that when seniors leaders do something that what seems so simple that just boosts morale in such a high way that it really feels like everyone cares about you in the end.
Oh yeah, yeah. Every time that they would show up at one of our outposts, that was a risk. They didn't always fly in, so they would take in as many risks hitting IEDs or ambushes along the way to check on their own troops. And that really, really cemented for me, that leaders are there with you alongside you.
That's right. I agree.
How would I'm sorry, I don't want to talk on you.
Now go ahead. I'll good.
I was just going to ask, how did you take those lessons and experiences and incorporate them into your own life and career?
Right. So throughout my career, I've always tried to be a leader that I learned how to be there in 573 Cav, right? I learned to try to take care of the soldiers that I had around me, right? I was an NCO at the time, so I went straight from 573 Cav to go be a platoon sergeant in my intelligence company. And I went from having 5 to 8 soldiers with me by the time I left 573 Cav as a leader to leading over 25 soldiers. So
Mm.
I learned then, hey, as a platoon sergeant, you got to utilize the skills that you learned from other leaders and now apply that in your own leadership style. And what I took away from 573 Cav really helped me to develop as a leader and understand what right looks like, right? There's often times that you don't immediately get to see what right looks like as far as leadership goes. But when I was in 573 Cav, I learned that, I saw it, and then I got to implement it there myself as both a platoon sergeant, and then I went to go be the S2N2IC of the regiment when I was there in California out at Fort Irwin.
Hmm.
That was just a stepping stone as a new leader in the Army, I would say, staff sergeant. You sergeant, you're kind of figuring things out, but once you become a staff sergeant, you're off to the races as far as being a leader, an organizational leader, and then making sure that the people that are following you aren't just following you because you're wearing the rank and you're you're telling them to do so.
Yeah, it's one thing about the military that I've found is an interesting conundrum for leadership. Similar to corporate world, but even more so. In the military, you don't have an option to say no. You don't have an option to just quit or stop or find a different job. So a leader has to also have trust and respect as well as the rank to make things happen. And for a leader to balance those as well, to know that what you say goes regardless of other ideas, but also to be open and listen to them. I just found that was a very unique aspect in 573.
That's right. Oftentimes, it wasn't always about the rank on your chest, but it was your capability. I remember there was a time when we were having some significant issues with detainees that were being taken back to the DHA, and then we would see them out on the battlefield after
Hmm.
just a month or so. And I remember Sergeant Major Edgar came to me and he said, I was a PFC at the time. He was like, "Hey, do you think that you could go out?" Which is very uncharacteristic of an intel analyst to go out and be a part of a company or a troop at that time to be in charge of leading detainee operations room. So Sergeant Major Edgar was like, "Hey, PFC Copeland, do you think that you could go out and make sure that the paperwork, because essentially what was happening was the chain of custody was being very messed up at the time. So they would go to the DHA, the chain of custody would be messed up, and then we would see these detainees out on the battlefield a couple months later. So Sergeant Major Edgar put me in charge of that. I was on all the detainee operations. So every operation that we had in 573 CAP during that deployment, I really went out, did all the chain of custody for that. I was even out there at one of the patrol bases for a long time. But the very first time that I took over that, Sergeant Major and the PSD, we all went up to Kanaki, and I took 4 soldiers that were in a prison there and got them all the way to the DHA there at Bob Warhorse.
Hmm.
So I remember he actually wrote me an award for that, probably because I was so junior. But at that organization, it wasn't really about your rank, it was about what was your capability, which is very similar to SAW. So I'm glad that I had that unique experience because it prepared me for that environment as well once I made the transition from, traditional conventional force to special operations, where I went and served 7 years after I left being a MICO platoon sergeant. So
Yeah, I noticed that as well. With a lot of our forward observers or other support assets, even at low ranks, they would be out in the field and actually directing fire. We would have E3, E4 medics doing combat casualty and medevac, 9 lines if needed. Rank didn't matter if you knew what you were doing. It just got the job done, and there was a trust organizationally that the intelligence aspects of the fight, at least 2006 to 2007. I know 573 had entered an area of operations that didn't have a lot of coalition presence before. Then afterwards, there were issues with the follow-on units that deployed as well. So 573 in a way became a really big source of intelligence, not just for our own unit, but for the entire region. We had a lot of contact up with MNFI and all of that. People were watching really closely. Were you aware of any of that? Did that cause any kind of pressure? And also, were there any skills that you learned out of that experience?
I would say throughout the majority of the deployment, I wouldn't say majority, I would say about 50-50. So a lot of the deployment, I was doing the detainee operations every time we had an operation. However, I passed that off to someone else to take over that, and then I did go back to doing intelligence for the remaining part of the deployment. And I would say, I was aware of that. We went from essentially just operating on the secret network to operating on the TS network that we had put in out there, and we saw the capabilities that we were able to do in order to enable the operations that were going on there throughout the entire time that we were there in Iraq on that first deployment. And then I would say even on the second deployment, it got the transition from 2006 to 2007 as far as capabilities goes increased dramatically on what we could do on the battlefield just from an intelligence standpoint there and the tools that we had available to us. So it was very unique to see that transition. It was very unique to see what reconnaissance was actually doing there on the battlefield. The very first Turkey Bowl all started just from a Black Hawk that was going around and saw a disturbed area on the earth, and they went to go investigate. Right, that all started just from the aerial reconnaissance. So it was, very unique on opportunities to know where to send people to look, and then once they go to that location, what are they looking for? You got to give them hey, this is what you're looking for when you're out there, so that they know what they're actually trying to find.
And did
And
you?
I believe that was the largest cache ever found in Iraq on that
Yes,
very first one.
yes. And if I remember correctly, a lot of the TOW anti-tank missiles that we found had been from Iran. They had been sold to Iran
That's right.
in the 80s, which made a very complex fight. Um, and on the intelligence side, I'm sure you guys saw more of that than we did, but yeah. So speaking of your second tour, did you notice a lot of institutional culture for like leadership that had retained even after the leaders had left? And how did that affect your second deployment? And also, I mean, you've kind of touched on it already, but how did you feel as a leader during that second deployment, using what you'd learned from your first experience?
I would say prior to us leaving for that second deployment, the unit got very immersed in the cavalry traditions. I think we all
Hmm.
saw that when we came back for the ball after that first deployment. Cavalry has a lot of traditions, and I believe we experienced that at the ball, but that carried forward through the entire time prior to our next deployment. We really tried to focus on reconnaissance as the primary mission. However, at the time going back to Iraq, that wasn't really what we were doing throughout the deployment. It was more so of a what you would see in a traditional infantry, you know, battalion. But I will say we did move multiple times. I remember on that second deployment, we started in, I want to say it was Baqubah, and then we ended up all the way on the southeastern side of Iraq by the end of the deployment. We moved to I believe it was a power plant by the end, and that's the majority of where a lot of our operations were going on. That was also during a period where a lot of the portion of Iraq, when we first went there, the first time we had the surge, but by the time 2009 came, it was more so of a drawdown, more or less. But I would say because of the intelligence that and the increased tool capabilities that we had, we were able to narrow our focus and know where we wanted to go and what we wanted to do to accomplish there.
Yeah, I do actually remember some of your second deployment. I had gotten out, re-enlisted in the Washington National Guard, and ended up in Victory Base. And I think some of y'all were over on Prosperity at the same time when I was on Victory.
I believe that was the second location we were at, and then we moved.
Yeah, during the drawdown, it was just a very different experience from our first tour. It was a lot more paperwork, a lot more liaison with local assets. And both actually on our first tour, we had a really strong liaison with local assets, especially for Iraqi augmentees, even though we were not like a training unit or anything of the sort. Did you work with many of the augmentees at all?
I do remember the majority of the missions that we went out with Iraqi force counterparts,
Hmm.
or we had to either meet up with them at the time to go out to operate during that deployment as well.
And did you learn anything particular there that would have helped in your future? I know I mean, I'm not sure what exactly you did with SF, but often working with indigenous partners is a big part of that, or other cultures where there's language barriers and other aspects.
Right. So not every country is the same, right? So working with the Iraqis was very interesting on what they could and could not do. Not every country is the same, but you at least understand that with regardless of what country you want to work with, building rapport is probably the most important because at the end of the day, the United States, oftentimes when they're partnering with other forces, you're teaching them something. If the individuals that you're teaching don't feel as though the information or the material that you're providing them isn't the best, oftentimes some information can be ignored, right? Or maybe they don't do it the best way due to whatever their learning environment is or how they learn, right? Whether it's verbal, nonverbal, or however it may be. But I did later on go work with special operations. So what I had learned there helped me a little bit when I went to go work with the Romanians, when I went to 10th Group, when I went to go work with a lot of the European countries. although they were much more lethal and already knew some of our tactics because they had worked with our organization in the past, building the rapport was probably more key than anything, right? I found that that's probably the number one thing that you want to do when you're working with another organization, regardless if, it's one country or another. That's definitely the number one way to get what you're trying to tell them understood, and then they can implement whatever it is that you're teaching them. It's a stepping stone to make it a good foundation for probably the best learning environment on how it is that you're showing them what you want them to do, and then they're doing what you actually want them to do, or they're implementing it the way that we're trying to show them how to do things. Because there's our way, and then there's the joint way, right? We work with a lot of partner forces at the joint level, and that's really what we're doing there, or multinational level, right? Because there's multiple different nations across multiple different joint forces. So that is definitely building rapport, I would say, is probably number one, right? And then you got to make sure that there's a language dialect there. So hopefully you got to make sure that they understand what you're telling them so that then they can implement it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I spoke with Dr. Strike about it as well a little bit and his own experiences in special forces. But with leadership, it just in business side, I've learned that a little bit of empathy is necessary for communication, especially between different peoples, learning what they need and how they feel about it. And being able to use that in different ways is such an effective leadership tool. And I know that that is something that I did see from my leaders when I was in 573. Like you, I came in as a fresh private and had no experience of the Army before that unit, which in a way kind of biased me ever since, because when you have an intense experience like that, you expect everything to be like it and don't realize just how gifted it is until afterwards. Was there any particular skills or anything that you learned from your experiences as a young enlisted soldier that you ended up using to mentor or train your own soldiers later on?
Yeah, I would say, the empathy piece that you mentioned is always needed, right? Especially now in the Army. The Army's changed a lot than it was 20 years ago when I first joined and when you first came in. 20 years is a long time. That's multiple generations of different caliber of soldiers that we've had throughout the military. And now that I'm running the 35 Fox, or the Intelligence Analyst 10 level course, which is the new soldiers that come into the military to become intelligence analysts, I run that schoolhouse. So I have over 80 non-commissioned officers, over 50 contractors, and then 15 Army civilians that I oversee. And oftentimes there's soldiers in my offense that are either being recommended for dismissal of the course due to failure of tests or whatever it may be. But you learn in that environment that empathy goes a long way, right? These soldiers could be going through personal issues back home. We've built in my organization exception policies to allow these soldiers to get the help that they need if they are going through something back home. There could be traumatic events that happen to them in previous organizations that is affecting there at the schoolhouse, right? There could be some sort of sexual assault or harassment that happened in basic training that then transitioned to them at the schoolhouse to where they need the help, and they did get the help that they need in taking care of the soldiers, right? We want to make sure we give everybody the same fair and equal opportunity to be successful, right? And not all soldiers are built the same. I think you have to understand that just as well as, every country that you work with is different. So understanding that everyone, one, understands information differently, and then two, everyone is going through things and not everyone experiences the same way and knows how to deal with it, right? I think we saw not just even in 573 Cav, we saw a lot of traumatic things in that deployment. And not everyone, when we came back, has handled them the same way. I would say one of the saddest parts about that deployment is that we're still losing brothers today from the organization because of self-inflicted wounds, because they're still dealing with some of those traumatic events, right? So you got under where I may be able to digest those feelings and deal with them the way that I am. Not everyone is capable of doing that. And I think you got to have some empathy, regardless of the position that you're in, to make you a successful leader, because not everyone does things the same way.
Yeah, exactly. And I know sometimes it's even just training related. When I joined the National Guard and we deployed a second time, the training they received on very basic things like clearing houses and collecting intelligence was so backwards that it was dangerous. It was deadly. Um, you brought up a really interesting point though about the battle after the battle, and I know you're still serving in the military. Have you given any thoughts to ways that your leadership skills have the things that you've learned can be applied to help those who are struggling on the outside after their service is done?
I would say just being actively involved, reaching out to those that are dealing with issues, right? When you're fighting those battles, sometimes it feels like everything's caving in on you. And oftentimes it just takes a phone call from someone to change that environment that you're going through at that time.
I just gonna say for me, one of the things that has always helped me was how we established just a unit social media group to be able to keep in contact with individuals and share stories. And without the hierarchy fades over time, but the individual relationships stay. And that's I've always been impressed seeing that leaders remain leaders long after their role as leaders is gone. I guess in a way, we never really stop being a leader once we take it. It's just our official duties will end.
That's right. And I think, you know, it's very hard when you go through some of the things in the military that you don't understand how to relate to someone that hasn't gone through those similar
Hmm.
experiences, right? So just having someone that you can lean on to be there that understands the environments that you went through together, right? Some of us have seen each other at the weakest time possible.
Hmm.
And although it's a vulnerable time, it's a time where you can relate with someone that has actually gone through the same thing. So I agree, staying in contact with those that are around you, even well after you've already moved on, because sometimes those people need that person to lean on well after they've already left the unit because they feel like they can't relate with anyone else,
Yeah,
either
very well said.
in the military or after they've already moved on outside.
Hmm. I see my time is running low here. So I just wanted to ask on kind of a lighter note, do you have any particular memory that's cherished, a funny situation or something that you've never forgotten, something that people should remember about your time with 573?
Well, the pizza was a pretty big one, right?
Yeah, I was in a Bradley, and sorry, I don't want to talk about me too much, but I've been stuck in a Bradley all of Turkey village that whole 2 weeks. It was raining, it sucked, and then all of a sudden someone knocks on the top and just thrusts a piece of pizza in at me, and I had been soaked for 2 weeks in there, and it was just I've never forgot that. Yeah, it was a Black Hawk resupply of pizza from Balad, Wild Tigers, and Miami cigarettes. Like,
Yeah. I would say, some great things about 500 Cav, especially when it comes to leadership, right?
mhm.
These leaders didn't just care about the organization and themselves. They cared about everyone around them. There was often times that I would see people come back from patrols and they would come into the talk, or I was at the DHA talking with another soldier, and all it takes is asking someone, how are things going back home, right? Because at the end of the
Mhm.
day, we're trying to get back home. We really care about our unit. We care about, being there. We're willing to sacrifice whatever we need to, but we would like to make it home as much as possible. And sometimes those simple conversations about asking someone how their family's doing, how their wife's doing, remembering the names of them when you go to talk to them again, sometimes that's all that takes to reinvigorate them and to rebuild, not only that relationship, but their motivation that reminds them, hey, this is why I'm doing the things that I'm doing. And I'm willing to sacrifice. And as long, because there's a lot of things that are going on at different times, right? So as a leader, sometimes all it takes is, just mentioning the little things and asking someone how they're really doing and if they're really okay, right? Because like I said, everyone handles things differently, but
Hmm.
yeah, it only takes a couple words of conversation to get someone to probably be back at the right motivation level or
Hmm.
really understand that you do have a family and that we're all on the same team doing the same thing.
Absolutely. And that takes establishing a relationship with the people around you to really work. You have the trust that when they've asked it, it's not cursory. They really mean it. And that really goes a long way, especially when you're under that kind of stress.
I remember Colonel Pappas would come back from some of these patrols because a lot of the times that he was out there on those missions,
Hmm.
probably more so than everyone else that was in the TOC operations center that we were in. And he would come back, and then after just an hour, he would make rounds and ask people how their grandma was doing or how
Hmm.
life was back home. And I think simple things like that oftentimes reinvigorate you to understand, like, hey, I am doing this. It may suck right now, but there's a lot of good positives still going on in my life that, there's one, people that love me back home, and then two, we're doing this mission and we're really getting after it. And let's focus on that so we can focus on the big picture, which is really getting back home, right?
I know we used a lot of Spartan imagery, and I always just thought of the phalanx, where the phalanx worked because on each side of you is another one of your men, and in 573, those men might be your officers, they might be enlisted, they might be a Joe, or they might be Lieutenant Colonel Pappas. It's
That's
they
right.
were there.
And I would say that felt like family. You
Hmm.
felt like almost
Exactly.
like you had a family back home, but at any time there was leadership around you that was going through the same thing that you're going through. And I would say not every organization you go to, which is one of the things that I learned in
Mm-hmm.
573 Cav, is are they willing to come down to the lowest level and do the same thing that you're doing that they asked you to do, right? And that's definitely one of the things throughout my career that I've always tried to do is get down there with the guys that are doing the hardest work, right? Because not everyone does that, but it definitely builds camaraderie. It definitely builds trust in you from them as to understand, like, hey, my leader's asking me to do this and he's not afraid to do it himself.
Absolutely. I remember when we first set up the outpost in Zagania and we had to do field hygiene. The PA, Brad Rather, he came out to dig slit trenches and fill sandbags with us. Even though it wasn't in his job description, he did it just because we were doing it because it's 120 degrees out and he's going to be dirty just like us. And that meant something. I've remembered it for almost 20 years. So,
Yeah, I mean, I remember that in that deployment too. Like, I was an intel analyst, but I went to an outpost and was digging trenches and doing security watches and unfortunately burning the everyone's waste.
yeah, that's the best detail ever though because no one will give you a hassle.
Yeah, all the other things you don't really talk about after deployment.
Yeah. Well, I got about 2 minutes left, so probably just wrap it up. Thanks again for talking to me about this, and yeah,
Yeah, it was a great time to be part of a great organization with great leaders, and I learned a lot in 573 Cav. I think most of the people that were there when it started and then now that it's ended could say that that type of organization not only rich in the cavalry tradition but rich in the leadership that they have there or that they have had, because a lot of those original 573 Cav members have came back to the unit. I mean, I went back there
hmm
as a W01, a brand new warrant officer, to go serve in 3rd Brigade. I did my promotion in the 573 Cav classroom from
oh
W01 to
wow,
W2 as the senior warrant officer for the entire brigade. So I know there's been a lot of leadership that came back to that organization because once you've been there, you feel invested and
hmm
you want to give back as much as you can. And I know I did, and I definitely was a foundation to where to building on to be the best leader that you could be, right?
I love it because you started off there as an E2. Now here you are teaching all the future E2s who are going to be, end up in your footsteps. It's an amazing experience and career arc.
Yeah, I even have when you walk into my building on the right hand side,
Mhm.
there's a huge wall, and there's pictures on there from all the different instructors that have been E1s or E2s, and down in the right hand corner is a picture of when I was an E2. Actually,
Mhm.
I was an E1. I got promoted to E2 in AIT, so I was an E1 sitting there going through the same experience that all those students.
30 seconds.
Yeah,
No, no, I love the story. I just don't want you to get cut off.
yeah.
Yeah.
So going through that same experience as they were.
Mhm. Well, perfect. Yeah. Thanks again. And hopefully we'll see you around at one of the reunions.
Yeah, I would love to come by for sure.